Hello everybody, I'm Evan Fuller, and this is my research presentation concerning metaconsciousness and its correlation with the religious mind. So to begin, we're going to dive into my research question because I really want to get that off. Is there a correlation between quantifiable metaconsciousness and measured devotion to a God, religiosity, in a population of high school age students? Don't worry, I'm going to define metaconsciousness in a little bit if you're confused, but just bear with me. So how did I, just get here? How did I get to this conclusion? So my entire life, the argument between faith and reason has been a very divisive and sort of prolific thing. And I see how it divides people, and I really want to get to the bare bones of the truth. Is there an actual difference between people that are faithful or people that are not? And so here, I took my past evidence of proven differences between theists and atheists in critical thinking. I said, does this apply to metaconscious decision-making as well? So just to give you a little bit of the foundation of that, the previous evidence I am referring to is Atheists and Agnostics Are More Reflective Than Religious Believers by Gordon Pennycook, who is a private researcher. This found that atheists, on average, were more, they did better at critical thinking tasks than faithful people did. So that would be theists. From that basis of foundation, I built upon that with conscious, preconscious, and subconscious. This is basically a paper about the idea of metaconsciousness and the preconscious aspect of our thoughts. So I then propelled myself to the third and sort of the most narrow, of course, the top of the pyramid being a signal detection theoretic approach for estimating metacognitive sensitivity from confidence ratings. So that's a lot of word salad, but that is a paper from Columbia University, a very well-known university, about how we can sort of funnel all of this into a statistical test. And so that's what I've replicated here. My hypothesis for this entire line of inquiry would be that if one measures metaconsciousness and religiosity, then they will discover a negative correlation between the two variables, similar to Pennycook and sort of just the logical continuation of what he found. Of course, this is only a maybe, and this would be my alternative, my hypothesis. My null would be that there will be no correlation at all, hopefully. So here we are with the definitions. Metaconsciousness is our confidence in our decisions versus if they are correct or not. Basically, if you think you've detected something, and there's a difference between thinking you've detected something and knowing you've detected something. So having confidence that you saw that car go by or that you saw that somebody pass you, for example, versus you being right or not. And so you can measure that with a lot of testing. Next, I have religiosity, and of course that's how religious a given individual is, but you can measure that with a Likert scale, which is what I do in my survey. And then next is the type 2 task, which is what I put in my survey, and it is the task of discriminating between one's correct and incorrect responses with confidence judgments. So this measures this completely we have a task that the observer goes through, they watch it, and then they say whether or not there was a stimulus present, and then they rate themselves off of their confidence. And so this can turn into a lot of things like the Dunning-Kruger effect, which I say here. So like someone who is very confident may be very wrong often, because that is a prevalent psychological trend. So that's a potential limitation to this, but I will elaborate on that later, and you'll see in the limitations. Let us begin with my methodology. I mean, I've sort of elaborated on this previously, but we have a 3-part survey. This was emailed to over 300 people, but it really begins, it's a Google form, it begins with the demographic section. Of course, we have consent, everybody consented, 100%. Then we have last name, first name, age, and sex. Of course, I put another option, and this was just for the sort of minor statistical correlations that you could find. Next, I have our first qualifying question: do you incorporate religious values into your everyday decisions? Based off of how the participants answer this, I would classify them as theist or atheist. 1 being completely atheist, 4 being completely theist. And then next, I have how much time per week do you spend worshiping a God? This would be to qualify the ones who are in the middle, that being 2 and 3. So this would help me push them either to the binary of theist or atheist, depending on how they responded to this. And then how often do you read the scripture of religion? All of this is just to funnel the participants down into that binary of theist, atheist, because that's what I'm correlating here. Next, I have all of the religions I could think of, and plus, and more. I have agnostic, atheist, Buddhist, Chinese traditional, Christian, Catholic, Protestant, Hindu, humanist, Jewish, Muslim, and Taoist, and Sikh. So you'd actually be surprised at what I find. It's actually a very diverse group that responds to this question. Next, we have a type of God that they believe in. This helps with classifying agnostics, of course, because it helps classify whether or not they are sort of an organizationally religious person or sort of a more personal, spiritualistic individual. And are actions being judged by God? This is the last qualifying question that I would use in tandem with the first qualifying question to just make it even more accurate. So that is part 2 of the survey. That was a religiosity survey that I got from the first, the preliminary foundation essay, or not essay, the foundation article from Gordon Pennycook. This survey actually has been used in many meta-analyses and other papers, such as a paper where religiosity was measured with belief in spirits and ghosts, and that was actually a very efficient paper. It has a very high efficacy with an internal rating of about 0.95, which means that 95% of the time it will yield similar results. So it's a good survey. Next is my metacognition phase of my survey. I begin with a sort of preliminary statement saying, just to address potential limitations, because you can repeat videos, which is exactly what I don't want. I want to run it once per question. So I have watched these 9 short videos in order in full screen. After each video, please spend around 10 seconds answering the questions, and be sure to use the entire scale of 1 to 4 for the second question. This should take about 3 minutes to complete. And please do not watch the video more than 1 time. I made sure this was very large because potentially people could go through and sort of optimize their questions and just kind of cheat. And I really did not want that because that was a massive limitation. We can play this if we want. Can we do that? Whatever. Basically, this is the last section. This is what someone watches right before they answer the question. It is a 0.33 millisecond blip of 2 stimuli. One has grading and the other does not, and you're supposed to find out in that 0.33 seconds whether or not the stimuli is present. And if they don't do that, and they think that they did, then they have a low metaconsciousness. And if they did do that and they think that they don't, then they also have a low metaconsciousness. You know what I mean? So if they got it right and they were confident, then they have a high metaconsciousness. That's sort of what I'm trying to convey. After they watch that, they answer which side contains the stimulus pattern. I have left, right, and neither. Based off of if they got that right, they would answer their confidence scale. And depending on how these are answered, you can guess their metaconsciousness, or not guess, but sort of expiate their metaconsciousness. So I had 11 total participants, which was much less than previously expected because I sent it to over 300 people. But what I did get was very diverse. It was actually very interesting to find. With a mean age of 17 and 63% male and 36% female, it is a relatively, I'll show you later, but it is a relatively diverse group. So the results of my survey are here with having 6 theists initially, 6 atheists, 3 theists, because this is the first qualifying question where we see do they believe or do they use religious thinking day to day. So we had 6 people that said no, never. And then we had 3 people that said that they do almost every day, or they do almost daily. And that's important because now we can separate theists and atheists and then continue to study them after we have this. See, this is actually the answers to our diversity question with our religions. So we have 1 Buddhist, 1 agnostic, multiple atheists, and then one specifically Protestant Christian. And so I thought this was a very good spread of people to sort of study, and I'm very happy about this result. Next, we can see that 45% of the population strongly disagree that our actions are being judged by God, which really helps because it's sort of almost a 50-50 split on their belief. So we have very obvious atheists, and then we have agnostics and like theists. So we have a good split, which will help for correlation later. These are the answers to the metaconsciousness questions. So this would be answers 1 through 6. So they had to repeat it 9 times, but I just wanted to show you that on average they will get them right because it's not that hard of a test. But what you see here is that some of them are very split, and we always have a minority that answers incorrectly. And depending on whether or not that minority is theist or atheist, we can measure their metaconsciousness. And so, for example, this was correct in that the right stimulus was present, the left stimulus was present, and then neither were present. So we have a trend showing that the majority of people are going to get it right, but there will be a significant minority. So for some conclusions from these results, I have the means for atheist and theist. That basically, the Columbia paper showed that the most straightforward way to measure metaconsciousness was to simply take a percentage of how many they got correct out of the how many questions there were. And because they said that this was the most straightforward method, it had some bias, but it was the most straightforward method because the alternative is to do so much math and just the most complex graduate level like statistics that this is accessible and it is efficient for what we're trying to do here. And so here we actually can see that atheists got it right 0.78% of the time. So that's the initial, is the stimulus there or not? Theists got it right 0.35% of the time. And so this was, but that would just be 35% of the time. And we can actually see that's really interesting because the confidence level for atheists is lower than it is for theists. So on the 1 to 4 scale, the mean average, or the mean score for their confidence was 2.47, which is just a little bit above medium. So they were just sort of lukewarmly confident. But theists were very confident in their decisions. Yet they had lower efficacy with which they answered their with which they judged their decisions. And so from this specific data set, I would conclude, like 100 times out of 100, that atheists and agnostics from this data set have a higher metaconsciousness, because that's just what this is. That's what you get out of this. So that would mean that my hypothesis, or my alternative hypothesis, would be accepted in that atheists and agnostics have a higher metaconsciousness on average. So this sort of evolved into a new understanding of that the limitations were too prevalent to be conclusive of a general population because of this. There was a very, very small population, that being 11 people, with the minimum statistical analysis being 30 people. So I couldn't perform a sample, two-sample z-test or anything that would be statistically important. And so that led me to all of the other limitations, which are that this was online, potentially repeatable. There could be potentially so much non-response bias with the fact that maybe religious people would not, or atheists would not want to respond to this at all. And then there could also be the presence of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which could be a potentially confounding variable. And after all that, I can say that this was this line of inquiry was very beneficial to conduct, and I really appreciated the process of it all. And here are my references, and that is all. Thank you.
Defense panel, you may start your questions.
Evan, how did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to your final research question?
All right. So with the initial discovery of all of Gordon Pennycook's papers, I found that there is a commonality, or a very prolific difference in the way that religious people and non-religious people think consciously, so the way they make decisions or the way they critically think. And that was a very interesting thing to find. So I wanted to see if that led into the idea of metacognition and sort of our preconscious, and how that affected, or to what extent does that disparity really exist in statistics. And so that's what I wanted to find.
All right, Evan, how do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
All right, well, I'm actually really excited to do more research on this because out of spite, this has never been, this has never been done before. And obviously, I would like to increase this population-wise to make it 100% efficient and 100% valid, because of course, due to limitations, we really cannot say that this is true or not based off of the population size. And I think in future directions, I would bring this a more statistical approach in the field of signal detection theory. And so I think that if we continue this line of inquiry with a signal detection theory lens and a lot of participants, then we could find potentially very interesting conclusions.
And then how did you handle the uncertainty of the research process?
I really just did the best I could to make it obvious to the participants what they should be doing and how I want them to be, or how I want them to interact with my survey. So in the email, I made it very obvious and very clear that that they should obviously not repeat this more than once, that they should do it with the utmost validity. For example, I told them all to keep their head about 2 feet away from the monitor, because that was the way that it was done in the metaconsciousness paper, the third one on the top of the pyramid. And so I just made sure that I stuck to what I knew, stuck to what the graduate level professors had done in the past, and that really helped out because they really know what's up. So sort of using their wisdom and then creating my own was really helpful.
All right, thank you so much.
Stay there.
All right, open the floor for additional questions.
Madeline.
With your first question, it was if you weren't religious at all or if you're religious.
Yeah.
And you only have you have 4 places
Yeah.
to choose. What would happen if you had a space in the middle for those people who aren't necessarily religious but they're not atheists, like they believe that there's something but not necessarily following a specific religion?
Well, I would correlate that with the last question, which actually did have a center option, which would be just completely in the middle, which would be just completely agnostic, which is just they completely give up their ego, they have no idea. And so I used that question on the last one to classify whether or not they were like what you're saying. Dominic?
You use Google Forms, right?
Yeah.
Does that show you each participant and their line of questions, what they answered?
Yeah. Shows you everything, gives you all the responses. It's very useful.
I have a question, actually. It's about the same question, I think, as what Maddie asked, because in that question, you asked how much time they spent worshiping God. But then in parentheses, you had praying and you had meditating, which meditating doesn't have to be a religious thing. So I'm just curious how, do you think that question, does it matter if those 2 things are synonymous or not? And because I feel like if you, worshiping a God and just meditating may not be the same thing. And so then does that skew that initial response? Because if they answered worshiping a God versus meditating, so how does that play in?
I can see how the sort of the connotation of meditation might kind of skew that, but I really meant that meditation is a commonplace thing in most Eastern religions, and so if there was someone that was answering that with an Eastern religion, then I think that would be more helpful for them to see, because they don't do the same things that we do, and I was sort of giving them the avenue, and that's what they do, But I didn't mean meditation. I meant more so like thought on the topic of religion or faithfulness, if they spent a lot of time thinking about it. Yeah. Yeah.
So because your variables were so like vastly different.
Yeah.
Like the variables of like religiosity and the metacognition, do you think there was like some underlying factors that swayed that data?
Yeah, completely. I mean, there's so much that could be at stake here. So I think, for example, when I was mentioning the Dunning-Kruger effect, that's something that shows up a lot with confidence tests, because people that will perform lower will usually have a higher confidence, and there's no way to know how prevalent that is in my data, and so that could just be a massive limitation. For example, in future directions, I could do a sort of a Dunning-Kruger effect test if that's possible, and I would make sure to filter that out. But thanks.
Can we actually go back to your slide that showed the variables, it showed the atheist, the theist, and then the so you said that you thought that this lent credit to your hypothesis, right?
Yes.
Because, but you also said that consciousness, like if you are, if you're more confident, but you have a lower score, then you have low,
Right.
yeah, low metaconscious, right? But if you have a high score and you're also less confident, you still have low
Right.
metaconscious.
So these both displayed low metaconsciousness, but on average, since the score was so high and these two were so close together, this was higher.
Did you do any math to figure that out, or are you just saying that by looking at the numbers?
This is just sort of obvious, but potentially in the future, I think that this data was just so like potentially inaccurate that there wasn't enough population to do that.
But
Yes, sir.
Did I miss your gap? Has Columbia already done this
No,
study?
Columbia was just on how to measure metaconsciousness. The gap itself is metaconsciousness prevalent more so in atheists or theists.
I was not clear on that. I thought that you had referenced Columbia and saying that they have already done it.
No, nobody has.
I'd be curious, is it different than, because I know like, we had a presentation earlier about IQs.
Mm-hmm.
Because that has been done with, so is this is different in your measurement? Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or do you know if those are similar?
Metaconscious and IQ?
I mean, metaconsciousness and IQ. I think
They're definitely correlated.
Are these correlated? Have you been able to, like the comparison of the religiosity and the metaconsciousness, is that similar to the religiosity and IQs, or is that?
No, it is, because this is the continuation of what Pennycook found in that IQ. Well, that would be a different paper, but he did find that critical thinking and religiosity were negatively correlated, and that would be the same thing here for metaconsciousness and religiosity. Negatively correlated, meaning that the higher the religiosity, the lower the metaconsciousness.